Thanks a lot for the invitation. I think I'm the first presenter that is kind of from here. I'm not going to count Lars. And, sort of, and out of like totally extremes. But one thing I like to say in behalf of myself and some of the, kind of students is kind of, especially for people like me and many of my, with Terry, this organizer, and classmates, it's kind of a lot of value added because we were not, we're kind of down the path. We were very happy that we were admitted, and we were tossed in a fantastic place. So it's like it's like a dream. So, and it's very different from the experiences that other people would have. I don't know. So we were not like Andy Atkinson. This is like, we were all value added in the sense that, we were tossed, immediately to like a lot of people at the U and at the Fed. It's just like we were saying yesterday. So everybody with the doors open. I work with Rao. I work with many. Work with a lot of people that went through the Fed and to the U, and not only the macro community, the people that are doing like for those of us that have small theoretical interest. So it was like a fantastic experience, and it's very, very different from what you could imagine like you could have if you have macro interest anywhere. So at least for our generation, it was really fantastic. All right, so now I'm going to talk about this paper with David Argent. I want to dissipate there's this rumor unfounded that he's Argentinian because the name, he's not. He's from Mexico. So I leave his honor now. And this is, we're going to be estimating the consumer surplus of using cash for payments in Uber, for Uber rides. So the broad motivation is that there are a lot of discussions about maybe it's sort of like the bad effects of having cash. Think about the demonetization of India. Think about also the title of the book by Rogoff, which is called The Curse of Cash. But of course, there may be also some private benefits, and this is a paper about the private benefits. And if you think about like more narrowly in the literature of money demand, you could think about that in different ways. But one way you could think about it is the choice of means of payment. And that way of thinking money demand is relatively new. I thought that it's not kind of more like the inventory type of, more like, sort of money demand. I think of that as coming from Lucas Stocky, 87, and also from Prescott, 87, which has a fantastic paper. It's less well known. It's even closer to the spirit of this paper, and papers later. I just put in some examples here, like Freeman and Kinlan, or a recent paper by Nancy. All right, and the other motivation is that there are actual bans on cash in Latin America, in Mexico, in many cities. If I have time, I'll talk more about it. All right, so the plan for the talk, I'll give you some background of Uber. We're going to do everything in Mexico, so I'm going to give you some background in Mexico. We're going to use some quasi-natural experiment. We have access to data from Uber, and we're going to interpret it in particular ways. That's what I mean, across different cities, et cetera. And if there's time, also, I'll talk about some data from Panama. We're going to write then a very simple model of the choice of means of payments and rights. And then we're going to kind of use, we did some experiments ourselves where we face riders with different choices and how they pay in Mexico. And from that, we're going to estimate basically the parameters that are needed to think about the consumer surplus that will be lost in a ban of cash. But today, I'll mostly also will concentrate on a particular one because it's sort of closer to some kind of reduced form time of monetary theory, which is elasticity substitution between cash and credit in terms of means of payments. But if I have time, I'll talk about kind of more of the rest. But then there's a recurrent number. So if you want to think about a number, so like a summary number will be 2, again. I think it's this one. And yeah, you can't see it, I guess. But it's 2. Well, now the 3 are dry. Anyway, it's 2. So so roughly when cash is allowed, there's twice as the activity kind of doubles, and the welfare cost of banning cash is 50% of what it has been expended on trips paid in cash, so 1/2. Okay. So that's so these are kind of 2 broad numbers that I want you to leave from this talk. Okay, some background of Uber in Mexico. So cash was, the idea of using cash to pay Uber started in India in 2015, and after that, Uber realized that a lot of people use it, and then they introduced it everywhere they could, except where regulations didn't allow it. And for instance, in 2016, there were 150 cities in the world. By now, there are many more than 400. In Latin America, 50% of the revenue of Uber comes from trips paid in cash. And in Mexico, Uber entered in 2013, and cash entered in 2016. So I'm going to show you some data from that. But just in case first that you could pay Uber with cash, that's something that people get surprised. And this is a screenshot of David, the non-Argentinian co-author. So, and you see that there's a green stuff. So basically, when you call an Uber, you could choose your means of payments. Okay, and that means that you'll pay in cash as if it were a taxi. Yeah.
So you actually give currency.
Handing, yeah, like in a taxi. So I was expecting that from someone much younger. Yeah, not. Okay, and these are different cities, and this is the share of trips paid in cash in 2018. You see the city, you won't see it, but trust me, at the top is Mexico, the outskirts of Mexico, which is about 40%. On the bottom, cities on the border with the US, which is more like 85%. So there's some variation across cities. This is a chart in which you have time. So this is 2013 to 2018, to the end of 2018. And that's when Uber entered across different cities in black. And then in blue is when cash started. And we're going to take basically and notice that there is a city that cash was allowed and then it was banned. We're going to go back to that. That city is called Puebla. So we're going to use kind of the period that is between the red lines to compare those cities in which cash was allowed and enter with the cities in which was never allowed, which are basically a couple of them, as a typical event study, as if this would have been kind of random. We could discuss these. The different experiments that we have, some are kind of more kind of reasonable. This is the less reasonable than that, but we have more information, so I let you judge it by yourself. And we're going to do this comparison with a bunch of variables. So this is a typical event study. Yeah. All right. Right now.
A conceptual one. Are you measuring benefits of cash in Mexico, or are you measuring the benefits of tax avoidance? Because I'm reading the Wall Street Journal today talked about moving Mexicans into digital currency or non-cash payments, and it's describing the main benefit is Mexicans are worried about the authorities would then track their payments and demand taxes.
I don't think that's the case. So I know what is they send the same information whether you pay with cash or with credit. So I don't think that's the case. So anyway, but yeah. So because they get this. Yeah.
Are we going to imagine that all these people who pay with cash also have a credit card?
No, we're going to measure. I'm going to get into detail. We're going to measure three types of people: those that have credit cards that don't want to use credit. 50% of the subjects are going to look at they have credit cards and they both pay with credit and cash. And about the remaining 25% of the people, and will account to more or less 20% of the dollar amount, are people that do not have credit cards registered with Uber. And in fact, we're going to take into account both intensive and extensive margin.
Even the one that will pay in cash have to be kind of Uber user, like some account.
Yes, you have to open some sort of account in Uber.
So they have all the information about how you want to pay it in cash too.
We do have it. I mean, we with David, yes. Yeah.
Are cash cards possible?
Very little. They are possible, but nobody uses them, prepaid cards. Okay. So typical event study. I'm just not going to show you the questions because I'm running out of time. So on the left-hand side, you have this. So we have, time effects, city effects, some other variables that we gather especially for this, and then the introduction of cash or not. So you're basically lining out the data and taking these averages, but let's say. And then the red line is the time, and the units are log. And you could see that there's very large changes. So this is the number of trips after the entry of cash. If you look at a year after that, then they have double the number of trips. And the same will be true with fares, and the same will be true with miles. I'm not going to show you that. There's, yes?
This is total trips on Uber.
On Uber, regardless of how you pay.
We don't know how much.
Yeah, we do, but I'm not going to show you that because there is substitution between them, and then I'm going to get into that in detail. But I want to give you an idea. A lot of this is in cash. This is the number of people that sign in. So the rider sign up goes up a lot. And the number of active riders, people with a trip in a week. Then there's no evidence. We haven't found any evidence of change on prices. This is the search multiplier on the left-hand side. And then this is the estimated time of arrival. So we haven't seen, this is a very large shock to demand, but we haven't seen any effect on it. This is the supply. Then a lot of drivers coming in, and also almost as much as the number of trips. And the difference is basically that drivers also are driving more hours. You could keep track of the number of hours, and the total number of hours of the drivers match the total number of trips. That could explain why the ETA and the search didn't change a lot.
Would the price discriminate based on means of payment?
No, but we will. We will engineer an experiment in which we face people with a bid.
Because they can't, or they choose not to?
They choose not to.
Do you have any information of riders, non-Uber, regular cab drivers? What does it
Do we say it? No.
Do you have information? I was thinking that one possibility is a lot of people don't use cash, they go ride with Uber, but there's a fall in rides in regular cab.
Okay, out of order. I'll talk about later. Okay. So we're going to think of this as that the supply. I mean, I'll talk about that. That's why I'm on due time. So this is sort of consistent with an elastic supply curve for drivers because high demand, no change in prices. I show you this. We find no evidence on change in Uber prices, and we have actually also gathered data from taxis and across all the cities, and we didn't find any effect on the price of taxis. I'm not going to show you, and I won't discuss the other topic because I will run out of time. Okay, this is all still kind of warm up. So something about Mexico City. So this is a city of Mexico. It's a lot of people, more than 20 million, so including the great area. The part in between is the federal district. So the story is like this. Cash, they had different regulations. In the federal district, cash was never allowed. In the outskirts, there was no cash until Uber realized of this cash technology. So we geolocalized all the trips on 3 consecutive August. These are many, many, many millions of trips. And then we match each trip, because the choice of means of payments is where you originated the trip, we geolocalize it with the census blocks, so we could also use variables from the census to think about how these places look like. And we're going to look at the growth rate of trips before and after cash enter in the outskirts and compare with blocks inside. But before that, so let me make a point that the effect is very heterogeneous. So this is on the outskirts where cash was allowed. We are plotting the share of cash in one axis and then stuff in the census that kind of has units of income, for instance, average year of education. We have around 60,000 blocks, but we do it being scattered so you could see it. It's very clearly negatively rated. The poorer you are, the higher the share of cash. And this is true for every single variable that we could get in the census that had units of income. Okay, back to this. So now, given that, what we're going to do is we're going to take Okay. So go to the gray area, take a block, then take all the variables, take 4 variables from the census, discretize them, say income, well, no, not income, no, say whatever, say education, one of them, so on and so forth. Then looked at a block inside the federal district where cash was never allowed and match them. And compare these 2 blocks. Do this for the 60,000 blocks. We could match about, around 95% of the blocks. Because the outskirts is kind of, the farther you get, the poorer it gets. That's why we're going to do that too. But I show you the figure before to show you that the effect is probably heterogeneous. So the edge is just for fun.
Okay, I thought I would have guessed those are the same
almost the same.
Yes,
as black.
I'm not disagreeing.
Yeah.
But I show you that the effects are very heterogeneous. And
Even within those.
no. I want to know the effect of increasing cash. Cash is used by poor people. Poor people live far away. At the edge, then there are rich people on both sides. Still are going to do that because of for fun. It's just to control for an observable.
The cash guys are out in the
They are, yes. Because we can measure these observables. All right. So when we do that, I'm not going to show you regressions. I don't have time to do this with this technique, but basically it doubles. The same as in the other study, which we use in comparable cities. So when you do this, match the comparables, it doubles the number of trips. Then the other thing that we could do is what you were asking. We're going to think that here we're going to sit on the border and we're going to compare the block here in the state of Mexico, the growth rate when cash was allowed, with the block here where cash was not allowed between the 2 years, and then you see. So we take each block, we measure the minimum distance until the border, we order then, we use the controls that we have, and then we feed this sort of flexible functional form to the right and to the left, and you see a large jump. The jump is smaller than 100% because this is kind of rich on both sides. For those of us that we have seen there, if you go to ETAM, if you go to the top floor, you could see the border. Okay, so it's not like super poor, the beginning of the state of Mexico. If you do that in the years after, when cash has entered on Mexico, has entered in the outskirts, no cash, then you don't find anything. This is a typical placebo test. That's why we requested for 3 years. Okay, so this is, within the identification here is kind of more clear, but we cannot look at some variables such as drivers, stuff like that, because they move. That's why we combine both of them. Lastly, the city of Puebla, there was a crime, allegedly, I had to say, committed by a Cabify driver. This is something between Uber and a regular taxi company. And as a consequence, there was a change on the law in Puebla, which ended up banning the use of cash in Uber. So then what we did, by this time, all the cities essentially, except 2, have cash. So we look for the cities before the prohibition of Uber of using cash that looks similar. This is what is called a synthetic control technique. So you look for a weighted average with non-negative weights that they match. Actually, we match daily trips, percentage of cash, length of the trips. So we compare. So we have our synthetic Puebla, which is this sort of weighted average of the city, and actual Puebla. What we're plotting here, well anyway, there. Where we are plotting is the difference between our synthetic Puebla and the actual Puebla. They're kind of close by, and then you see a date in which there's a discontinuity, which is when cash is not allowed. And the drop is on the order of 50%. Then it recovers a little bit, okay? And this is, I'm showing you weekly data, but it recovers kind of fast. So first of all, it's a bit asymmetric. The band with the entry, this is kind of what you should expect if you think about the theory, but I will not go through it. And second, it recovers a little bit. I'm going to go back to what Neil was saying. I don't have time to explain it in detail, but one thing that we do is we look at Ellen, say she was a pure cash user before the ban, and then, but 2 weeks after the ban in Puebla, we see her register the credit card. And a lot of people do it. So probably Ellen did have a credit card. You don't get a credit card in a week in Mexico. So first of all, is registering a credit card in the application may not mean just having a credit card. Overall, if you follow people until the hazard rates stabilize, what we conclude is that 35% of the pure cash users that were there end up registering credit cards in excess what they were registering otherwise. So keep this number in mind. Okay, I won't talk about Panama, which is and I won't talk about this. I think I'm running out of time. So how am I doing with time?
You have 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll restrain myself and I will not. I was actually hungry for equations and truly Greek letters, so let me go through this. So now, but there's no Kolmogorov forward equation. I feel like naked. So anyway, so this is a model where there are, and this is going to be related to, so this is a model there will be n plus 1 good. The n plus 1 good will be the outside good. It will be quasi-linear, the preferences. And the good one will be a composite good made of Uber paid in cash and Uber paid in credit. So we're going to take Uber paid in cash and Uber paid in credit as if we're different goods. I'm very happy that Neil was not my discussant from now on. So anyway, so x1 is that good. And think about h to be an homogeneous of degree 1 function. It's going to be CS in the examples when we estimated, which will tell us how you combine Uber paid in cash or Uber paid in credit into one good, which we're going to call composite Uber rides. Okay. So these are the preferences, which is on the right-hand side of the equation that says fixing prices. That's a budget constraint. And on the left-hand side is the indirect utility function. Then notice that it has two prices, P cash, so we're going to use A for cash, and C for credit. It could have been the other way around, I know. Juanpa told me, but anyway. Huh? Oh, phi is something that tells you a vector of your preferences, because we're going to estimate it across heterogeneity. Okay. So PA and PC, so people pay the same price, but we're going to experiment of them, and also, for clarity, pretend that the prices could be different. So PA, cash, PC, credit of Uber. And the other ones, maybe the other good is taxis, and maybe the other good is, I don't know, so some other goods that are kind of closely related to. Okay. So the idea will be that suppose that we set PA to infinity for a person that does have registered a credit card because he has access to both of them. That will be the cost because we have this indirect utility function. So we're trying to estimate this object. But still, we need to think about also the other, the intensive. This is the intensive margin, the extensive margin. So for that, think about this script B, which has this vector.
Bring in the x2 if you really think that's taxis, the highly substitutable.
Yes, exactly. We don't need to. This is all for fun. Why we don't need the x2? I'll come back to that. It's the envelope. That's the answer. But let me finish this. I'll set a proposition, and then you'll see, okay, I see now what Fernando is doing. I hope. So, okay, so script B is now so theta is a vector that has your fee plus some other parameter, which is a fixed cost of registering a car. Maybe getting the car, maybe registering. Okay, so if you don't pay this cost, then you have what is on the left-hand side, which means that the price of credit, C, is infinity. So you can use credit, and you can only use cash. If you pay the fixed cost, you face the two prices. The two prices will be the same, but in general, I need this notation. Okay, so the vector of types is theta. That has a fee, which is kind of all the intensive stuff, plus a cost, which is how much it will cost you to register a car. So that's going to be our model. Okay. So one is an indicator that with these prices and for this type, you do register a car. And then A star and A tilde are the demands. A star is the optimal. A tilde is the demand for someone that have registered a credit card and is choosing between the two. And A star has into account the demand for Uber paid in cash, taking into account also the decision to register a credit card or not. F is the distribution of types. And I'm going to normalize the prices in Mexico to be 1. I'm just saying how lengthy a trip is. It's just a normalization. All right. So, okay, so there's what's going on in Mexico, and then there will be a ban. We have quasi-linear preferences, so we could aggregate them, so we'll compute the consumer surplus. So it's whatever they're going to have after, whatever they have now minus the utility that they have in the ban. So look at the first line. The first line is, okay, so you have registered a car. That's the I, C, you're type theta. Then you were what I'm going to call in general a mixed user. You're facing both prices, 1, 1. And now you're going to become a pure credit user, because after the ban, that's the only thing you could do. Now you have registered the car, so you could become a credit user if you want. Then there is the other one, let's say Ricardo. Ricardo was a has not registered a car. Then before was a B1 infinity type, as if the price was infinity for him. Now he could say, has two options, either no Uber or registering a car. Remember, in Puebla, 35% of the people did it. Okay, so this is not pie in the sky. So if I knew, okay, so that's a number that I want to know. And then I want to kind of do this integral across types. And that's a number that we said that's going to be 50% of the total amount of expenditure paid in cash, according to our estimates. Okay. So first thing is just a simple argument, which is really an application of the envelope, slightly more because we have both the intensive and extensive margin, but at the end, it's sort of an application of the envelope, which is the following. Suppose that you could measure this demand. Now, this is the demand in which I keep in the price of Uber paid in credit constant, and I start increasing the price of Uber paid in cash. And what's going to happen is that some people, okay, for you, it will be, well, you were using both, maybe you lose a different amount. Then for him, maybe he's using less and less of cash, eventually maybe registering a car, maybe dropping, okay. So that's this demand. Notice that this has the same weights on the top one, and it has the optimal decision rules. Now, in principle, okay, and the result is the obvious one, which is the area under the demand is the consumer surplus. It's not a trivial result because you have both margins, but it extends sort of trivially. You have to, and I don't need the price of taxes because I don't need the price of anything. If all the prices are constant, that's why we went through measure the price of taxes of the substitutes, then the area under demand gives you the consumer surplus. Okay, so that's, and the fact that it's also true for extensive, that's even Marshall. If you think about how we teach undergraduates, I remember teaching them here, like, which is, oh, this is the person, this is the little stick on the demand, which is the difference between the price and the reservation. Anyway, that's it. So, okay, so what is that we wanted to do, which we couldn't? We went to Uber and we said, let's do the following. Have a control group, we don't change prices. You guys have 10% higher in cash, 20%, 30%, 50%, and to 200%. Keep it for a long time, and we could measure the area and the demand. To which they reacted that way. They say, you guys are crazy, out of your mind. Also, at the university, they told us, didn't you sign all these things that you're not going to hurt people and stuff? OK, back to square one. So we couldn't do that. So we lowered prices. Somehow, we were lucky. We got a bunch of money to lower prices, a lot of money, actually, because we have very large groups, to lower the prices, still pay the same to the drivers, and now we need to live out of some combination of functional forms, because from the low prices, we had to extend the demand to higher prices, and also because when we have people that, Ricardo, that didn't have credit cards, but if we lower the price, there is nothing like unregister a credit card and get the cost back. So we end up doing 3 very large experiments, one to address the mixed users, and then 2 to address the Ricardos of the world, because we need to do it differently for the extensive and intensive margin. So let me turn to that. Okay, so this has mixed users, okay? So let's say we also have the pure credit users, which he never have used cash. He's not gonna be affected because I show you the prices didn't increase when you increase cash, so he's going to be unaffected by the ban of cash. But we have our mixed user. The mixed user will be affected. So let's think about how. So first of all, let's count how many mixed users. So 50% so look at this one. 50% of the, this is the distribution. OK, so we looked at her, and then the first time she used both means of payment, we put a tag, toss the data, and we look at her from now on. And then we print in here the distribution of the share of trips paid in cash. And that's the distribution that you see on the right, both in dollars and in number of trips. It's not the same because there's a relationship. Anyway, this is what it is. ¿Qué me está dando? Ah, thanks. Thanks. You can prepare, man. So, OK, so you see this is, OK, and so there's a large distribution of people that paid regularly with different means of payments. OK, then we did the following experiment. So now let's say that everybody in the first row, they are mixed users. So you're going to be the control group. Then he gets 10% only if he pays in cash, 20% only if he pays in cash, 10% discount only if he pays with credit, 20% only if he pays with credit, 10% regardless, and R gets 20% either way, OK? All right, so now we have all these groups. And notice also that from historical data, I know her share of cash. Just because I know from Uber what was her share of cash. So if you think about a CS, I know the parameter when prices are equal, because the prices are equal, and I know it for every single person. And now I'm going to have this exogenous price variation. So we could set this in terms of regressions, and we have done this in the paper. We could set this in more kind of, yes? We send them an email the week before. We send them an email where it start, and in your Uber, on the part underneath, when you open it, I now know the Uber names, the Alloy card, and then in that thing it says, when you open it, hey, you have a promotion, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so, but of course, okay, so let me now show you regressions. So what you have in the horizontal axis are the relative prices. And you basically are fitting this line in which this is the line for a given person of the share of trip paid in credit. Alpha will be the parameter for her utility function. He has a different parameter, etc. You could integrate it over them and actually measure the distribution in the data. And that's what we do. And then we looked at each of the groups, how much they change, and that's what is being plotted on the vertical axis. This is the observed share during the experiment of the trips paid in credit as you vary the relative prices as you integrate with the correct distribution. You could also do this in terms of a regression framework, but I like more and then I have no parameter except eta, which is elasticity substitution. I show you 3 pictures with 3 different etas. And then the confidence interval, because people do, it's kind of random stuff. So, all right. So, no, in the sense that you should think about people taking 1 or 2 trips a week. So that's why you need to think of this as random utility and aggregated. But I don't have time to get into that. All right. OK, so from that, we get an elasticity substitution of 3, which we think is higher than 1, but it's kind of low for, OK, this is just us. We think it's low, but it is what it is. So if you forbid her something with an elasticity substitution of 3, then she's going to be hurt, because she's using both means of payments that are far from perfect substitutes. But to conclude how bad it is for her, think about the following. Imagine computing the ideal price index. We know her elasticity substitution. We know her shares. We could do it for every single person. The ideal price index goes up. How much depends on the share and the elasticity substitution. And now we need to know her attitude towards an increase in price of Uber, the ideal price index, how much she substitute Uber against all the other goods. And for that, we have Art and the person that was, I forgot who was the other, I think it was, whatever. The other person that we change the prices regardless. So, and we also use some other estimates. Ubernomics is an estimate that comes from, we have very large, anyway, I don't have time. So Ubernomics is something that John List did, and Mandin is an experiment that the people from Mexico did independently. These are price elasticities. So we estimate these price elasticities. We get kind of similar numbers, but we have very large samples because they were designed on purpose for this. And then this picture will give you kind of the summary for the mixed users. And I'm going to be running out of time for the pure cash users. I'm sorry, but let me just. So on this, you have the cash share, which is this parameter that we estimated before. You have an elasticity substitution and a price elasticity that give you, and I put some different parameters so you get the idea of what's going on. This function, and this is the consumer surplus lost as a function of basically your cash share. If your cash share is high, that's bad when there's a ban of cash. If your cash share is 0, it doesn't really matter. And then also it depends, notice that it gets flat, and the reason why it gets flat is because eventually the ideal price index goes so much that you go to the choke price, to the price in which you're not taking Uber anymore. Which, by the way, we ran a very large survey, a survey in 300,000 riders, to also ask them the choke price and ask them questions that we knew the answer, the experiment to try to validate it. And we also use data from Panama, where there's a natural experiment with a very large increase on prices, because the choke price is important. Anyway, so we get this number from here. Then we integrate this with distribution of alphas, which we have seen, and we also weighted by the distribution of trips, and we get the number for the mixed users. I don't have time to kind of explain it in detail, but I have 0 time. So for the pure cash users, we did 2 experiments. We changed prices, and we also give them rewards if they register the credit card. And we had to put together these 2 experiments to find out what would have been the cost for him. When we put all this together, let me put the conclusions. When we put this together, is that we get this number that is 50%. And I apologize that I ran out of time for both questions. Anyway.
I would thank Fabrizio for this opportunity to discuss this paper, except he gave me about 4 papers to discuss. The actual body of this paper is 63 pages with 76 pages of appendices. I will confess I did not read the appendices, but I did read the other 63 pages. And it is worth every minute I spent on it, I will tell you that. It is one very, very impressive paper. Actually, Fernando told me in sort of our discussions is why this doesn't seem like one organized paper, and it's because he was kind of writing this before Uber did its IPO, and so he kind of had to put everything together. And if I'm right, am I the first person that's read it, the entire, well, not the entire thing, but anyway, so it's really got 3 major parts, and I was wondering why it wasn't 3 papers, but first of all, he talks about the effects of introducing an additional means of payment, then the effects of banning an existing one, and measuring the loss of consumer surplus from a ban on using cash as payment. So since I have to prove, following Richard, that I actually did read it, I will go through my fluffy summary very quick. Also, Fernando didn't have enough time to get through all 63 pages of the paper. So first he did an event study, the effects of removing the ban on cash in 15 cities. Finds that trips and fare are more than double, slightly more than half due to existing riders making more trips. The price was roughly unaffected, and there's a highly elastic supply of Uber drivers. That was the event study. Now in this same section, they then go in and do a second one, which was the neighboring region ones, which was that really cool, what I call it's figure 8 if you go read the paper, what he'd call the placebo graph. But he showed that the shares of trips paid in cash is negatively related to income, and then using those matching census tracts, he showed that trips and fares really double after that cash was allowed as a means of payment. What I also found very interesting was the comparison of 2017 and 2018 between the census tracts. You notice there was no discontinuity after there was no change in whether or not you could use cash or credit. Then there was the Pueblo experiment. This is where cash got banned. And he's got 2 types of evidence. First of all, he does a synthetic Puebla. Basically goes out and tries to find some cities in Mexico that sort of are like Puebla, and sees what happens to them when you don't ban cash, and he sees quite an effect. Then he goes out and does what is called coarse and exact matching. They match census blocks with Puebla with comparable ones in the state of Mexico, and finds a decrease of 50% in the number of trips and fares. That 30 to 40% of the pure cash users ended up adopting credit. Approximately 65% of the pure cash users stopped using Uber at all after the ban came into effect. And that mixed users also decreased the number of trips once cash was banned in Puebla. So once again, amazing data sets, and notice that they don't just go after these questions using one data set, they do usually 2, sometimes more than that when they're going after these questions. Quite impressive. Then, and this is what I found was amazing, they got Uber to actually let them do these experiments of giving mixed users different prices, giving them the discounts of 10 and 20% to mixed users. Then they were able to go in with people who were cash users only, and they faced them with different prices. And experiment 3, I'll talk about 1 and 2 in just a minute, but experiment 3, they actually, Uber allowed them to give incentives for going out and registering credit cards with them. They did find that there was a larger migration for larger incentives. What do you know? Prices matter. And mostly, the adoptions, though, were users that already had a credit card. This is what he already mentioned, that it seemed that most of the increase of people registering their credit cards happened within a week, not in a long period of time. And in Mexico, it takes longer than a week to get a credit card. But the increase in the adoption rate was somewhat less than 5%, so it wasn't huge. There was an effect, but it wasn't a huge one. To talk about the first 2 users, for mixed users, cash and credit were far from perfect substitutes. This he got out of the first two experiments. We got an estimate of around 3. Overall, the loss of consumer surplus, as a percentage of the yearly expenditure on Uber, it was about 45% for the pure cash users and 25% for the users. And then when he combined the two of them, he got about a loss of 50% from the ban, and not surprisingly, the cost of the ban on using cash fell mostly on the poor. Okay, I don't think that would surprise anyone. But again, I found it really amazing, and he talked about the amount of money it took that Uber was really willing to put up to go in and actually run these experiments and give people discounts on Uber fares. Obviously, I really liked the paper. The estimate of consumer surplus was a very difficult exercise, and it's done in the paper in sort of section 7 and then in section 8. Section 7 kind of lays out the theoretical framework, and then without sort of stopping that one, you get into all these experiments, and you're kind of wondering what's going on. And for someone like me who's not that into estimating consumer surplus, it would have been sort of helpful if there had been kind of a more step-by-step description of how he was doing the estimates, more along the lines of what he did here in terms of the presentation today. Also, there's so many results in this paper. It would have been very handy, I think, to have a summary at the end. But as I now realize from talking to him, this isn't intended to be one paper. I think it's intended to be several papers when they go to write it up and put it out in journals. In the conclusion, and he also stressed it here, this paper is a contribution to the study of optimal choice of, and I highlighted the term means of payment, okay? I wanted to kind of stay away from demand for money, and not just because in one of my first years at the bank, I was giving a paper it had something to do with money, and I had, this is old. I had a transparency up. Anybody remember those? Besides, all of us old guys. And before I could say one word, Ed Prescott says, "What do you mean by money?" But I think studies on means of payment are really relevant now, given, first of all, there's a plethora of new potential means of payment out there. I'm thinking of the fact that right now there are over 2,000 of things that people would be calling digital currencies or cryptocurrencies out there. Now, yes, I know that a number of them are really restricted to sort of being what are called utility tokens or being used for specific platforms, but there are a large number of them that have the potential to be used as means of payment. You've all heard the potential launch of Libra by Facebook. I think that's going to be kind of interesting to analyze and discuss from the point of view of a means of payment. And there are a number of advancements right now in digital ledger technology. I have blockchains in parentheses. I hate to use that word because if you start reading sort of this literature on crypto, you will find that they're not very good on definitions, and so what I might mean when I say blockchain might not be what you mean when you say blockchain, but if I say digital ledger, I think we'll be all right. So I think with those possibles out there, with those developments, I think it's kind of going to be very important to start going in and analyzing means of payment. What I like reading sort of the crypto literature is they've got a nice word for it. They call it the rails, okay? And I think if you think of it as sort of the rails, the way you move this stuff from one person or one entity to another, it will be very useful. Now, those of you who know me know I have to talk about history. I can't sort of leave it alone. And if I look at the history sort of with regard to means of payment, what I see out there is that new means of payment seem to arise to sort of fix deficiencies in existing means of payment. To quote something dear to Art's heart, I would like to say maybe you could call this good money drives out bad as opposed to the usual Gresham's law. Here's a couple of examples. I've got to pick on Sweden because if you go back and look at Sweden, Sweden's got a very, very interesting monetary history. There's a period back in the 1600s, going maybe even to the 1700s, when Sweden actually has two different means of exchange or units of account going on. They have it in account in terms of silver money and in terms of copper money, but they will have silver coins that are actually denominated in copper money. It's really quite unusual. Well, here are a couple of historical examples from Sweden. Something called the Stockholmsbank, the first bank that was ever started in Sweden. It started in 1661. And the deficiency at that time is that Sweden, for reasons I won't go into, was on the copper standard. Copper is not tremendously valuable, all right? If you've ever been to the Currency Museum in Stockholm, what you will find is they have a replica of what is probably the largest coin that was ever coined. It is that thick, it is that round, and it weighs 40 pounds. It was relatively large denomination, okay? But you could imagine, the story that I've heard is that if you were going to make a large payment in Sweden, you did it in the winter. Why? Because you could load it on the sled and slide it across the ice, okay? I've also found a quote from somebody who knows about Sweden. It said, even the payment of small sums made the use of carriers and horses necessary. The rest of that quote says, sort of the common denomination was a coin that weighed a little over 3 pounds, okay? So you can imagine carrying that around. So what was the innovation? Well, this guy who started this bank in 1661 came up with the banknote, okay? And paper is a heck of a lot easier to carry around than copper coins. What I've been able to find from reading this particular literature is that there was actually a premium paid on these paper banknotes, okay, over the nasty to carry copper stuff. So to finish that story, however, he kind of sort of overextended, as you might expect. He was doing sort of fractional reserve note issue, and we all know about, you know, the problems with that. So he kind of went out of business in 1664, but there is debate. To finish the story, then what happened is the Swedish legislature in 1669 actually came around and said, we'll really sort of restart up that bank, but we won't let them issue banknotes, although they got around that in the early 1700s. And it's sort of this second bank is really why the Riksbank is celebrating 250 years of existence this year, although many Swedish historians say this is really the beginning of the Riksbank. The other are these Enskilda banknotes. And Enskilda Bank is a private bank. And until 1831, really, private banks weren't allowed in Sweden. But the Riksbank notes were circulating, and they were, you know, paper and metallic currencies. Okay, but what you've got to do if you're trying to set up a bank is you've got to issue, you know, you're basically transforming assets, right? And if you're transforming them, you've got to transform them into something that people are willing to take, okay? And so how do you get people to, I'm out of time already, okay? I'll follow Fernando's example. So what they did is they exploited a deficiency in the Riksbank notes, which was that they were kind of in inconvenience denominations. So what they did is they switched the denominations, came up with lower denominations, made it more convenient, and guess what? Their notes got into circulation, and it wasn't long before they had more circulation than the Riksbank did in terms of notes. So what about today? I would say that current sovereign currencies do have some deficiencies. They're up there. There's two views of the current situation. One view is that it's highly improbable that any privately created electronic currency will displace fiat currency as a widespread means of payment. That's probably the view of most of you in the room. But there are some others out there who basically say conventional fiat currencies are staring at a bleak future, in fact, their fate could be sealed in a couple of years from now. This is actually somebody who's the CEO of a stable coin. But anyway, I think that studies of this are going to be useful when they think about design of central bank digital currencies. And I'd also like them to use studies like this when they're thinking about, the costs involved in banning things like Libra, which seems to be high on the agenda of our Congress right now. And since I have no time, I'll just tell you, I really like the paper. I think it's a great contribution, and it's an amazing paper.